In this video, I'm going to go over how to process two-dimensional NMR. I'm going to be going over processing an HSQC and a COSY. Before we begin, it's important that we start with a fully processed 1D spectra. In the case of a COSY, you're going to need a hydrogen, 1D hydrogen spectra. And in the case of the HSQC, you are going to need a fully processed hydrogen and carbon spectra. Though you actually don't require that carbon spectra, you can actually get away with processing an HSQC even if you don't have a carbon spectra. And I'll get into that in a little bit later. But for your guys' assignment, you're going to be using both a hydrogen and a carbon spectra to process your two-dimensional spectra as well. So the first thing that we need to do is we need to make sure that both of those one-dimensional spectra are fully processed to get the integration, peak picking, and if you want, you can also assign all of those peaks to a structure. You can, if you know the structure of your compound, you can draw that structure in MestreNova, and then you can assign each individual resonance to that position in that structure. And I'll show you really quick how to do that. So let's use this methyl signal right here as an example. We'll zoom in on that methyl signal. And this methyl corresponds to this position right here at 18. And I want to assign that resonance to that position on that molecule. And the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to go up to Analysis. I'm going to go to Assignments, Manual Assignments. I'm then going to click on that resonance that I want to assign. And then I'm going to click on that methyl that I want to assign it to. And there we go. Now we see that that number 18 has appeared above that methyl signal, letting us know that it was properly assigned. A bunch of other assignments also popped up because I did assign this entire structure earlier today. So I have all the assignments finished. You do not need to do this step to process 2D data, but I would recommend it, especially if you're doing structural elucidation. Doing this step will definitely help with that structural elucidation in the further steps. So yeah, I definitely recommend you do this assignment step. So now that we're starting with a fully processed hydrogen and carbon spectra, and if you guys noticed, I do not have a carbon spectra in my data set, but you guys will. So just pretend that I have one. So now that we have a fully processed hydrogen spectra, we are now going to move into the two-dimensional data. And we're going to start off with this COSY spectra. So first thing we want to do is we want to make sure that the one-dimensional spectra is set up properly in this COSY. So the COSY is a hydrogen-hydrogen correlation. So we have a hydrogen spectra in the vertical and in the horizontal. And let's say when you loaded the spectra in, it didn't load in this spectra properly. It didn't load in this upper trace. The way you can fix that is you can right-click on this upper spectra, this 1D spectra, and then go to Setup. And here it allows you to load in different spectra. If I had multiple different 1D spectra, let's say 3 different versions of my hydrogen spectra, I would have 3 different hydrogen spectra here. And I can choose which one I put up here by simply highlighting that one. We only have one, so I'm just going to highlight this only one. And then you hit this checkbox right here. And what that's going to do is it's going to load that spectra in to both positions. So this one's going to load it into the horizontal trace. This one's going to load it into the vertical trace. Our spectra was already loaded, so nothing was changed. But in the event that your 1D data does not get loaded into your 2D data, that is how you fix that. The second thing we're going to want to do before we start any processing or any like peak picking is we want to do a baseline correction. This usually isn't necessary, but sometimes it can clean up that 2D data a little better. And the way I go about doing that is I go to this baseline correction tool up here. I choose baseline correction, and I'm just going to use the default parameters. You could change things if you would like and play with it to see what happens, but I'm just going to be using the default for now. And there wasn't really much change after doing the baseline correction. Next thing we want to do is, just like in a 1D spectra, we need to reference this spectra so that the ppm values match what they are supposed to be. And we need to find a signal that we are going to reference. And in this case, we are going to reference the chloroform signal. We're going to use the solvent for reference. And we do have a signal right down here in the 2D. We're going to zoom in on that. And right down here is our chloroform signal. It is almost right outside of our spectral window. So this experiment could have definitely benefited by having a larger spectral window, but we can still see that chloroform signal and we can appropriately reference it. So it's going to automatically lock in. And just to let you guys know, if you needed to, like, let's say, go onto a peak and it keeps on locking into where you don't want it, if you hold down the shift button, it allows you to move it around freely. And you can peak pick wherever you want. Hitting that shift button again allows it to lock into where the software thinks that signal is. So I'm going to click right there. Our referencing box came up. Since this is a 2D spectra, we need to reference both dimensions. So we have to reference it twice. So right now we're in the F2 dimension. I'm going to go to solvent, go to chloroform. Then I'm going to go to the F1 dimension. Once again, go to chloroform, hit OK. And now our spectra is properly referenced. If we were to zoom back in on that chloroform signal, we would see that the 1D spectra up here and the 1D spectra over here matches up perfectly with that spot in the 2 dimensions now. So we have set up our 1D spectra along the sides of our 2-dimensional spectra. We have done a baseline correction and we have referenced the spectra. Now we go about finishing the processing by doing peak picking. We don't have to worry about integration and stuff like that with 2-dimensional data. It's really just peak picking. And in the case of a COSY, you don't want to pick anything on this diagonal line. Pretty much a COSY is a hydrogen-hydrogen correlation, and everything on this diagonal line is just correlating with itself. So you'll always get this diagonal line coming across the spectra. The signals that we're actually after are the ones above and below this diagonal line, and they're actually mirrored. So the ones below this diagonal line are mirrored above the diagonal line. So you don't need to pick both sets. Just pick whichever ones you think are best. And I'll kind of give you an example of that. We will look at this set of signals down here. These 3 signals here are along the diagonal, so we don't want those. These are just it correlating with itself. But this signal and this signal are not on the diagonal. These are real signals, but they are the same signal. We have this kind of weird single and doublet, which is correlating with this multiplet over here. And if we look up here, it's that same single and doublet correlating with that multiplet. So we just pick whichever one you think is the cleanest. So I'm going to go to my peak picking tool, peak by peak. And I kind of think these ones are cleaner, so I'm going to use the ones below the diagonal. Now we're going to zoom back out and look at the other signals. We're going to look at these ones down here as well. Looks like we have some over here. We can use our mouse wheel to increase and decrease the intensity of those signals. If you increase it too much, you do get a lot of noise and you can crash MestreNova if you increase it too much. I like to keep it just where I can barely see them. All right, go back to peak. We're going to pick that one, that one. There we go. We're just picking all the resonances. And if you look closely, it does lock on to multiple positions. And if you want to be super, super accurate, you could pick every single position that it locks in on, but really just a single position in there just to show you where those correlations are is all that is necessary. So we're going to zoom back out, look up here, the last sections. And once again, pick all of these relevant signals. And we'll grab that one too. And we'll grab this one above the diagonal. All right. So we pretty much picked all of the important peaks that I've seen. Looks like there's one that I missed. I'll grab it real quick. Maybe not. Yeah. So it looks like we got all the peaks that are important. When you guys do your processing, I recommend that you look at it a little more closely than I did. Make sure that you're getting all of those peaks and that you're not missing any. And once that is finished, once all of the peaks are picked, that is pretty much the end of the processing of a HSQC, of a COSY. There is another step that we can do, which I will get into at the end of the video, but for the bare minimum, that is what is required to process a COSY. Now moving into the HSQC, we have down here a loaded HSQC, and just like with the hydrogen spectra, we can change the traces by right-clicking, going to setup. And normally when you load one of these in, you will have both a carbon trace and a hydrogen trace. But once again, I do not have a carbon spectra in this data set, so we don't have any carbon spectra to go here. But this actually is a really neat trick. If you ever want to get just quick carbon data and you don't want to wait like a couple of hours for a carbon to run, what you can do is you can just run a proton and a quick HSQC. And as you can see, if we zoom in on these signals, even though we don't have a carbon trace, we can still determine what their carbon shift is because we still have a scale for that carbon shift. So this is just like an extra trick that you guys can do if you don't want to run a carbon, if it's going to take too long, or if you don't have enough sample, you can get carbon data simply from an HSQC without ever actually running a carbon. In your guys' case, in your assignment, you will have a carbon spectra and you will load that carbon spectra up in here. You will do it by going into setup, clicking on the carbon spectra, and then loading it into the vertical trace. I don't have one, so I'm just going to deselect that box, and we're just not going to worry about it for now. Just like with the COSY, you need to also reference the HSQC, and it's referenced the exact same way as the COSY. I'm going to skip the referencing in this video, mainly because we do not see that, that signal for the chloroform in the HSQC. So I am not able to reference this because we don't have a referenceable signal. But you will have one in your spectra, and it's going to be referenced the exact same way that it was done in the COSY. So we have our 1D spectra set up in our HSQC. This is our 1D up here. This is our proton. In my case, I do not have a carbon, but you will have a carbon in yours. The next steps that we need to do is once again do a baseline correction, just like we did with the COSY. And also an additional thing that you need to do with an HSQC is a phase correction. When you first get this spectra and you load it in, it's not going to be looking this clean. It's probably going to look closer like, there we go. I'm going to look closer like that, and I'll zoom in so you guys can get a better look at that. So when you first load in your HSQC, it's going to kind of look like these star patterns, these crosses, and we need to properly phase adjust it to get rid of that so we can kind of get everything in just one spot where it's not smudged out as much. And you're going to want to zoom out so you can see the entire spectra. You're going to go over here to where it says phase correction. You could use the automatic phase correction if you would like. I always recommend using the manual correction. And the way you use this is you simply click inside this blue box here, and then you move your cursor up or down. And as you can see, it's starting to change like how much it's stretched out or not. So I see if I'm going down, it's stretching out more, so I'm going to go up. Now it's starting to kind of come together a bit. And now I kind of went too far, so I'm going to bring it back a little. And now it looks good in the horizontal direction. Let's change our dimensions to F1 so we can adjust the vertical. So going down is making it more stretched out, so I'm going to go up. I went too far, and right there looks really good. So let's zoom in on some of those signals, see how that phasing looks. So yeah, phasing looks nice. We still have a little stretched out along like the periphery of the spectra, but it's not too bad. This is definitely workable. So once we have it referenced, baseline corrected, and then phased properly, we're going to do the same thing as the COSY, and we are going to do some peak picking. In this case, though, we're going to pick every single signal because we don't have one of those diagonals coming across like we do in the COSY. So we're going to go to peak by peak, and we are going to pick each individual HSQC signal. I recommend that you zoom in so that you are more accurate in your peak picking than I am being right now. The software does lock in to the signals, but it is always a good idea to kind of zoom in to make sure that where it's locking in is where it's supposed to be and that everything that you're picking is appropriate. So once we have everything picked, this is pretty much the end of the processing of this HSQC. This is pretty much good enough to go into a supplementary section of a paper. You don't need to print out the reporting of the 2D data. There are some times where you have to do that for like ACH publications, but those are kind of like special case scenarios. That's not very often. So I'm not going to be going into that here. Pretty much all that you guys need to worry about for this is to reference it, to baseline correct it, to phase correct the HSQC, and then peak pick all of the appropriate signals. And that would be pretty much the end of the processing for this. There is one other thing that I want to show you guys though, and this is kind of an extra step. When you guys are doing research, if you ever have to do like structural elucidation, you have a spectra of a compound that you don't know what it is, here's a little trick that will definitely help you with that structural elucidation process. So once we have everything set, let's go back to this hydrogen spectra. And if you remember, I assigned all of these hydrogen peaks to this structure. And I did that for a really good reason, because if I didn't know what this structure was, I could still assign all of these peaks. I could just draw like a random structure or just draw a long alkyl chain and assign all of these to random things. And that allows us to do something to the other 2D spectra, which allows us to process them easier. And pretty much once you have everything assigned, you can go up to View, go to Tables, go down to Assignments, and open up the Assignments table. And what we have here is linked spectra and available spectra. And the linked spectra over here is that 1D hydrogen spectra. And over here, the stuff that is not linked is our 2D data, our HSQC and our COSY. So let's highlight those and bring it over to the linked side. And now all three of these spectra are linked. And what that's going to do is all of these assignments are going to translate over to the 2D data. And now let's look at that COSY. And now all of those assignments are now lined up. So if you didn't know what this structure was, if you were trying to kind of keep track of where all these assignments are and what's correlating to what, having these assignments up here automatically telling you what it is in the 1D helps you put together the molecule a lot easier. And I definitely recommend doing this extra step. Some people say it looks a little messy, but it's definitely helpful for me. It also translates over to the HSQC data as well. And one last thing, there is a second step that you can do to make the processing even more accurate. Once again, this is not required. Not even in most publication journals require this. But if you wanted to go the extra step to make sure everything was perfectly processed, what you can do is you can include all of these correlation datas into the assignments of this guy. So what we can do is we can go up to, while we're in our COSY, we can go up to Analysis, Assignment, and Manual Assignment. And let's look at this peak. Let's say, where's a good one? Let's go with this one right here. 20 is correlating with 21. So right where we have 20 and 21 crossing, we have a signal right there. And we want that to be reflected in our assignments as well. So while we have this manual assignment tool enabled, I'm going to click on that signal. Then I'm going to go back into our 1D spectra where our structure is. And that correlation was between 20 and 21. Now I'm going to click on 20, which is right here, and 21. And now what we have in our 2D HSQC is we have that assignment listed down here. So when you're going through the data, you see this spot. Oh, this spot is the correlation of 20 and 21. And one last thing that I will include, once again, this is all just extra information that you don't need to worry about too much, is the assignments tables. So if you go to Table and then go down to Assignments and open up that Assignments table, all that information is also being inputted inside this table right here. So if you're having trouble using the manual assignment tool, clicking on peaks and then clicking on the molecule, you can actually input all of that information manually inside here. As we see, it already has the COSY correlation of 17' and 17 double prime correlating with each other. So it already has some of the correlations already in here. Here's the correlation of 21 and 20, which I just did. You don't really need to go into this much depth But once again, if you are trying to solve a structure and you want that much detail, that detail is available for you. And that pretty much in a nutshell is how to process the 2D spectra. Just a quick review, you're going to want to start with a fully processed 1D hydrogen and carbon. For the COSY, you're going to want to do a baseline correction and referencing, and then you peak pick all of the relevant signals. And then for the HSQC, you're going to be doing the same thing as the COSY. You're going to be doing a baseline correction, you're going to reference it, but in addition to that, you also need to do a phase correction. And then once all that is done, you just do the normal peak picking, and there is no assignment table or assignment chart that you have to worry about. Pretty much just having this is a properly processed spectra.